Hello, friends. We are excited that our No Small Endeavor Plus community is growing. Now, all of our friends in the No Small Endeavor orbit are intelligent, smarter than average, winsome, good-looking, while the members of NSC Plus seem especially so because they are enjoying ad-free episodes as well as special subscriber-only content once a month where we discuss habits and practices learned from our guests over the years. And those special episodes have been a lot of fun, personal and practical. I love sitting down with our producer, Jacob Lewis, and recording those for you. And so we would love to have you join us. And your NSC Plus membership helps support the show. So because of all of these things, we'd love for you to join the NSC Plus family. Just go to nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up on our subscriber-only episodes today. Again, go now, nosmallendeavor.com, click subscribe, and start catching up. See you there. Hello, friends. I'm Lee C. Camp. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Bill McKibben. Bill is one of the earliest and perhaps best-known journalists who began to bring a great deal of attention to climate change way back in the 1980s. Has done a great deal of work writing books, activism, and a lot of work educating the public in America about climate change. I hope you find this episode helpful that we're kind of redropping in honor of Earth Day. Enjoy. Bill McKibben is a contributing writer to The New Yorker, founder of Third Act, which organizes people over the age of 60 to work on climate and racial justice. He founded the first global grassroots and climate campaign, 350.org, and serves as the Schumann Distinguished Professor in Residence at Middlebury College in Vermont. In 2014, he was awarded the Right Livelihood Prize, sometimes called the Alternative Nobel, in the Swedish Parliament. He's also won the Gandhi Peace Award and honorary degrees from 19 colleges and universities. He's written over a dozen books about the environment, including his first, The End of Nature, published in 1989. And his most recent, which we're discussing today, The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. A graying American looks back at his suburban boyhood and wonders what the hell happened. Welcome, Bill McKibben.
What a pleasure to be with you.
It's great to have you with us. And I've very much enjoyed reading your book and grateful for the time to get to talk to you today. You start perhaps in part one of this book in a place that I would imagine a lot of folks would not expect a kind of stereotypical American liberal to start. And that is talking about his love of the flag and the love of what his boyhood memories of telling stories about early American history have entailed. But kind of how has that early, describe for folks the way in which your early boyhood there in Lexington, Massachusetts has informed your notion of American patriotism?
Well, Lexington styles itself as the birthplace of American liberty. And it was there on the green in the center of town, the first battle of the American Revolution. And for many years, when I was in junior high and high school, my summer job was giving tours of that battle green. Busloads of tourists would arrive, and I, in my tricorn hat, would lead them around the battle green and tell over and over and over again the story of those brave farmers who took part in the first battle against imperialism and colonialism and stood up to the mightiest empire in the world. And it's a great story that I enjoyed telling and that has in many ways informed my whole life. Among other things, it made it very clear to me from an early age that dissent and patriotism could be very much the same thing.
Yeah, you speak of the way in which that the story of the underdog has been central to you. And a beautiful quote, you say, you carried with it an anger at arbitrary power, that refusal to allow one person to lord it over another or over the whole. That is the glory of American history. And it's why I've never wanted to give up the flag. You tell this fascinating story about an early incident that happened in there at Lexington that involved your father and the whole kind of community coming together in its own act of mass dissent. Would you describe that for us?
I sure will. Maybe if we get the chance, I'll tell you about two things that happened in the same spring because they were very interesting. This takes us back to the year 1971, and I was 10 or 11. the height of the protests about the Vietnam War. And because the Battle Green was such a symbolic place, the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, led by a just returned lanky, charismatic, handsome young lieutenant named John Kerry, wanted to camp out on Lexington Green as part of their protest. The town fathers were having none of it, and they were all fathers in those days. And so they sent in the police to arrest these men before they could commit the crime of camping out on the Battle Green, at which point hundreds of townspeople, including my very mild-mannered father, a business reporter, decided to join them. And hundreds of people were arrested and spent the night at the town DPW garage, sleeping on the floor next to the snowplows. And that remains the largest action of civil disobedience in Massachusetts history. And it really, for me, I mean, it obviously stuck right in my mind. Seeing your dad get busted at the age of 10 is a big deal. But it to me symbolized what I thought was, in my 10-year-old mind, going on in the world right then. That we were in a moment when we were working hard to try and make the world a better place. It wasn't as if there weren't plenty of problems. We had turmoil over the war, the assassinations, Watergate was soon to come. But things seemed on a path toward what LBJ called the Great Society, or Dr. King called the beloved community. I mean, we were taking women seriously as equal parts of society for the first time. The civil rights movement had reached its apex. There had just been the first Earth Day with 20 million Americans, 10% of the population out in the streets demanding action. And in those days, our government worked. So within a year, we had the Clean Air Act and the Environmental Protection Agency and so on. So to me, that those events had always seemed, in their way, quite optimistic. When I was doing the research for this book, however, and spending a lot of time in the archives of the newspaper, I learned another story that was going on just weeks apart from that one. Lexington was a affluent, sort of suburban community. Which meant that, among other things, it was mostly or almost entirely white, not because of any explicit segregation. In fact, it was a liberal place, as you say, and Dr. King had been welcomed there to give a speech the year before, a couple of years before, and things. But it was expensive enough that it was almost entirely white. So in that spring of 1971, the town fathers, this time, announced plans for a modest affordable housing development, 100 units of multifamily housing. And everybody got behind it, the churches and the planning board and the Suburban Responsibility Commission and so on and so forth, except that they then held a referendum on it. And in the privacy of the voting booth, Lexingtonians voted 2-1 against affordable housing. And truthfully, Lexington is even whiter today than it was in 1971. There's fewer Black people, at any rate, living there, which is the other half of this story. That even in that moment of sort of social optimism, there was also this kind of the selfish side of American history was showing through in precisely the same places.
It seems in many ways this kind of sets up the tone for the project that runs throughout your book, is that you're simultaneously trying to say what's beautiful and redeemable about the American story and what's deeply problematic that we have to own about the American story. And as you go on and say in this chapter, the debate over the flag is above all a question about race in America, kind of highlighted by that second story you just told. And I suppose in one way you could think of it that this is a story that represents that what you loved about the flag, the pushing for the underdog, the standing up against tyrannical power, that the second story is really an unwillingness to do that, or a failure to live up to that best sort of vision. Is that a fair enough way to kind of put what
Very
you're getting
much
at there?
so, very much so, and it goes, right back to the beginning. I mean, look, one of the hardest stories to tell, one that I came across in the course of writing this book, dates back to the Revolution. It's about Paul Revere, who was riding out to Lexington to sound the alarm that the British were coming. And in his account of that ride, which I was reading just almost by happenstance, the account that Longfellow used to write his famous poem, Revere says, just in passing, when he's describing escaping this group of British officers on horseback, he said, "It was right under the place where Mark hung in chains." And that brief reference fascinated me, so I did some detective work, and it was fairly hard. There hasn't been much at all written about this.
Huh.
But it turns out it's a reference to a man named Mark Codman, who'd been a slave in Boston 20 years before the Revolution. He'd had a particularly cruel master, and so he'd poisoned him. He was charged not with murder, but with treason. And when he was drawn and quartered, his body was placed in an iron cage, a gibbet, and hung above the common in Charlestown, where it stayed for 40 years, becoming such a landmark that Revere could assume that everyone would know what he was talking about. And so that puts, from the beginning, a slightly different spin on what the Sons of Liberty were all about and who exactly we were standing up for as we began this fight. It's the kind of work that the kind of history that things like the 1619 Project have done a good job of beginning to get out, and caused a kind of backlash too, because we don't necessarily want to hear it. But for me, the point is that if we are to take heart from the really good things about American history, we have no choice but to reckon first with the dark sides of it as well, and to make some kind of reparations for those, to repair the damage that's been done. If we do that, then I think we're entitled to think of American history in some of the ways that we once innocently did. If we don't do that, then American history is not what we thought it was.
Describe for us a bit more the case that you make about economics and the case for reparations.
Well, let bygones be bygones is it's not a very noble sentiment if you're the one who came out on top.
Yeah.
So that house in Lexington that my parents bought for $30,000 in 1970, that would be $200,000 in today's money. It sold last year for $1 million. That $800,000 appreciation was just the payoff for being in the right place at the right time. But there were plenty of people who couldn't be in the right place at the right time. Either they were in parts of the country where there were legal prohibitions on Black people buying property, or much more often, just in places where the fact that Black people had been systematically discriminated against and impoverished over the preceding 200 years made it highly unlikely they were going to have that 30 grand. And so they missed out on what became the greatest escalator to wealth that the world's ever seen. I mean, there's never been wealth creation like there was in America over the last 50 years. And the appreciation of suburban property values was at the absolute heart of that. That is why, the big reason why, the wealth gap between white and Black Americans is wider now than it was 50 years ago. That's a debt that needs repaying in one form or another. And I don't pretend to know exactly what form that debt should be paid in or exactly how it, but I know that it needs to be, or else we're not, we're not honoring our debts.
You give some statistics about the particularities of that wealth gap. Can you cite some of those for us?
Sure. I mean, first thing to be said is that this takes place also in an era of just rising economic inequality in general. 1978, the year that I graduated from high school, was the year that what economists call the Great Compression, the fact that America was becoming a more economically just place in the years after World War II, that ended in 1978, and instead we began this rush in the other direction, which now has reached the kind of cartoonish proportions where individual Americans, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, have as much wealth as the bottom half of the population combined, but it's particularly acute for Americans of color, especially Black Americans, and the levels of wealth accumulation among Black Americans taken as a whole are staggeringly small. In some parts of the country, literally negative. People have no family wealth, and so that's that is a challenge. It is a challenge to all of us to figure out how, as a society, to address that. And we've had some good leads about how to do that. People like Ta-Nehisi Coates doing really serious moral journalism to try and get us to grapple with it. But so far, it's a bridge too far politically. Indeed, I think that a great deal of this reaction against teaching about race in the school system of the last 18 months is probably a kind of defensive move among a lot of Americans to avoid having this precise discussion because it makes them uncomfortable. I don't think they're worried that much about their children feeling guilty. Kids are completely able to handle history. They understand that it's something that that it's not their fault. But I think it makes older people feel uncomfortable, and they don't want to have to deal with it.
Yeah. And I think, too, that there's probably a lot of historical ignorance of a lot of the economic, social practices that occurred to contribute to these sorts of things. You alluded to some of those, but redlining, which prohibited people of color getting mortgages in particular areas.
The GI Bill didn't work for returning servicemen who are African American. When we drew up Social Security in the 1930s, it excluded farmers and domestic workers, which were the two biggest categories of employment for Black Americans, which meant, that their children had to take care of their parents in their old age in ways that white people did, and prevented the formation of the kind of wealth that could be passed along and help people with a down payment on their house, for instance. So, the fix was in for a very long time, going back, of course, to the fact that for several hundred years, we just took free labor from Black people to help build America.
You say that in 2014, for every dollar in a white household, a Black household had less than 7 cents.
Those are, the stark bottom line numbers really drive home this message. And I don't think people always realize just how big these gulfs are or how historically determined they were. And if we do realize it, maybe it will rouse our better angels and set them to work.
In the next big section of the book, entitled "The Cross," you take a similar sort of approach where you're pointing to the things that some of the things you believe beautiful, compelling, and true, not only about Christianity but about Christianity in America, and yet at the same time trying to grapple with the failings historically of Christian practice in America. But I guess first. Some may, I don't know, may not be surprised to know that you've been a practicing Christian all of your life.
Well, it's not that surprising because at least in the world I grew up in, it was the kind of default,
Yeah, right.
In fact, my particular brand of Christianity was the default. In the 1960s, 52% of Americans belonged to one of the mainline Protestant denominations. They were Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Congregationalists. I was confirmed into the Congregational church, but then because I've moved out to the sticks in my adulthood, I've been a Methodist the rest of my life. That 52% is now 15%. The enormous erosion of that mainline Protestant tradition, and truthfully, replaced in many cases with a Christianity that looks very different. As you know from the book, one of the things I think that happened politically in this country, and maybe we'll discuss it, is the way that we moved from a nation that emerged with a sense of solidarity from the Depression and the Second World War, and was engaged in this project of building what LBJ called the Great Society, or King, the beloved community. And instead, by the 1980s and Ronald Reagan, had switched to a world where we were much more focused on people as individuals, and the project was getting rich or whatever as individuals. Well, in religious terms, an awful lot of what happened was the transition to a different kind of Christianity, one that tended to view the relationship with God in somewhat more transactional terms. It was about one's personal salvation, and I think the kind of fact that that political and that theological trends overlapped in those ways is probably significant, and informs us a lot about what happened with religiosity in America. But yes, you're right. I've stuck with the tradition in which I grew up all these decades.
Well, since you raised that, let's talk about that a little bit more, because you allude to the rise of American evangelicalism latter part of the 20th century, and tell some of that story. But you also say that you don't really think that the rise of that ugly form of evangelicalism is the most important change in American Christianity in the last half century, but it's instead this sort of emphasis upon hyper-individualism as opposed to a sense of community and commitment to community. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, let's talk about it in secular terms too. To my mind, the most important event, political event of my lifetime, was the election between Carter and Reagan in 1980. And I think what it really amounted to was a referendum, in some ways not unlike that referendum on a decade earlier on housing in Lexington, on whether we were going to go forward as a society or as individuals. Remember, it was Reagan's contention that government, which of course is just another name for all of us together trying to work out our destiny, was the problem, not the solution. It was Reagan's great pal, Margaret Thatcher, who said memorably, there is no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women. And it's in that spirit that we've proceeded in many ways since Reagan, I think, and only now, Joe Biden making what efforts he can to sort of bring us back. A reminder that I'm afraid that Joe Biden came of age in precisely the period we're talking about, back perhaps to something a little more like what LBJ or FDR, or for that matter Eisenhower or Truman had understood about America. So that hyper-individualism, I think, is the hallmark of the world that we have created. And I think it explains a great amount about what's gone wrong with America in political terms, but even in social terms. And it's very connected with this question of the suburb. The project of America, for most of my lifetime, the economic project, has been building bigger houses farther apart from each other. And when you build that kind of world, Well, one of the necessary corollaries is you reduce the sense of community. The average American has half as many close friends as the average American of the 1950s. That's an enormous loss for a socially evolved primate, and I'm afraid it probably explains a good deal about some of the sadness and dysfunction that marks our world right now.
Hmm. The I think you allude to it in this book, but I know from reading other things about you that early in your career, I guess early 20s, just out of college, that the Gospels kind of became significant texts or practice for you. I think you even indicated that you spent time when you were writing for the New Yorker, you'd pull off to a room and at lunchtime or something and write them out by longhand in a spiral bound notebook.
Yes, which was good for me because, though I'd loved the church where I grew up, I don't think my spiritual formation had perhaps been quite as deep as it should have been, because it came as a great revelation to me to be reading those Gospels and realizing precisely how radical they were. I was doing this in the early days of the Reagan years in the 1980s when I was a very young man. And every message that was coming through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John was the opposite of what was coming through the Washington Post or the New York Times at that period. We were it was quite shocking to see just how insistent Jesus was on the idea that you were supposed to give what you had to the poor. The idea that you were supposed to turn the other cheek is a kind of cliche in our society, but clearly in the Sermon on the Mount, it's meant to be quite real. If someone attacks you, that's, nonviolence is the way you're supposed to respond. Yes, the happily for me, the plain language of the Gospels hit very hard, and I think has had a fair amount to do with how I've ended up spending my life. So I was very grateful for that.
You also ended up writing a book, I think, indebted to the Book of Job, perhaps due to your wife encouraging you to read the Book of Job.
Yes. Of all the books, at least in the Hebrew Bible, maybe in the whole Bible, in some ways my favorite is the Book of Job. And I should say the first 38 chapters are a bit of a haul.
Indeed.
If you've forgotten, it's the story of a good man, Job, who suddenly finds himself inexplicably beset with all kinds of woes. He ends up living on a dung heap at the edge of town, covered with oozing sores. Not the patient Job of legend. The actual Job, in fact, quite vociferously demands that God present himself and explain what's going on here. His friends keep saying, well, obviously you've sinned and that's the problem, you're being punished for it. And Job is, no, I was a good man. If I did anything wrong, it was not on this scale. And so be careful what you wish for. Finally, God does appear, speaking out of a tornado, and delivers. Well, you're the theologian here, but I think it's the longest soliloquy that God delivers anywhere in the Bible, Old Testament or New. And it's I love it because it's the first great piece of nature writing in the Western canon. Buzzing and cruel and mysterious and sexy and biologically quite accurate. It's a kind of tour of the physical universe and all its grandeur. But it's also conducted in a very sarcastic tone. God is annoyed at being called out and says to Job, if you're so smart, you tell me, do you know where I tell the proud waves to break and no further? Can you summon up a storm like I can? On and on and on. And after 3 chapters of this, Job basically says, sorry, I asked, can I sit down now? Which is The reason it meant so much to me was because I was thinking about climate change early on. I wrote the first book about climate change in 1989. And, and what Job was saying is what human beings have always had to say. I'm small in the face of a very large created order, much bigger than me. I'm a small part of it. That's what God's telling Job and what Job is recognizing. But all of a sudden, that wasn't true anymore. By changing the temperature of the earth, we were managing to make ourselves very, very large. Suddenly, we were casting a shadow across the entire planet. We were able to, if God asked us, can you tell the proud waves where to break? We were like, yeah, absolutely. We're going to, our habits and economies are going to determine how high the sea level rises. That's us, and so I'm indebted to Job for that insight about what I think our task is now, which is to try and figure out how to make ourselves a little smaller so that we do not overwhelm creation. At the moment, we're running Genesis in reverse. We're decreating this planet just as fast as we possibly can. And every single thing that God announced was good about the earth, we're managing to drive to the edge of extinction. So we've got some serious thinking to do, and then some serious work to do thereafter.
You noted a moment ago in talking about the Gospels, the sense of a calling to nonviolence, and that seems to have been a persistent assumed central practice for you in your life. So in addition to the Gospels, what have been other kind of sources that have informed that, whether those be historical, philosophical, or personal experiences?
Well, of course, I grew up in Lexington, next door to Concord, where one Henry David Thoreau had really been the first person in the world to consciously engage in what he called, in the title of that great essay, civil disobedience. Gone to jail to protest the American aggression on the southern border. And when his friend Emerson came to visit him and said, "What are you doing in jail, Henry?" He said, "Ralph, what are you doing out of jail?" Tolstoy read Thoreau and wrote about it. And then Gandhi read Tolstoy writing about Thoreau, and Gandhi developed what's got to be one of the greatest technologies of the 20th century, this idea of nonviolent movement building as a way for the powerless to stand up to the powerful. So, and then Dr. King took it and gave it, made it make sense in the American vernacular and in the Christian tradition, tying it straight back to not only the Sermon on the Mount, but of course the kind of crucial event in Western history, the crucifixion. And so in my life, the power that we've had to figure out how to stand up to is the fossil fuel industry and their insistence that they're be allowed to maintain their profitable business model even as it wrecks the planet around us. So yes, I've been to jail now a number of times and helped send others there. And sometimes that's not always, it's been useful. I mean, we've managed to do things like stop vast pipeline projects and so on that we probably couldn't have done if we hadn't had recourse to this set of tools.
In the third major part of the book, you turn to the station wagon as kind of the symbol of the ways in which the car and the suburb have been central to the American economic project. And central to the wealth gap, as you alluded to earlier in this interview. And then you say, the story of choosing private over public has been the crucial philosophical shift of my lifetime. Talk to us a little bit more about that.
Well, first, let's just talk about cars, man, because that's I mean, the station wagon for your younger listeners, the station wagon was the thing we had before the SUV, and we thought it was big back then. Station wagon, and we loved them. Everybody in town had one. You'd pile all the kids in the back, and when I say pile them in the back, I mean we'd all just crawl into the cargo area at the back of the station wagon. Now you'd be arrested for child endangerment if you drove like that. But we just took it for granted. And we took everything about the car for granted. The interstate highway system was still new. Vacation meant piling in the car and driving someplace. And the suburb was, as you say, the kind of rendering in brick and wood and concrete of our love affair with the car. Only the car made that physical construction possible. So it was a real shock in the 1970s when we had two oil crises and the price of gasoline went through the roof. And that was part of the backdrop for this choice between Carter and Reagan, really. Could we continue doing just as we were doing? Or did we perhaps need to change? And Jimmy Carter, Sunday school teacher that he was, said quite plainly, and I quote in the book, and the speeches that Carter gave are quite remarkable. Consumption cannot bring us the happiness we're looking for. We need to figure out other ways. Well, one of the ways that he proposed dealing with those oil shocks was to embark the U.S. on a major plan of trying to build solar energy. His last budget in 1980 envisioned an America that was started paying for an America that would have derived 20% of its energy from solar power by the year 2000. Had we done that, we didn't even know about global warming in those days, but had we done that, we would have been far better prepared to deal with the climate crisis than we are now. But Ronald Reagan said, no way, we're going to just drill our way out of this. And he climbed up on the roof of the White House and took down the solar panels that Jimmy Carter had put up there because, solar power was for sissies. And that was a kind of emblematic reminder of this change. The fact is that American suburbanization was the single largest cloud of carbon dioxide that's gone into the atmosphere. It beats out even the number 2 candidate, the industrialization of China in the last 25 years. In 1970, America was using a third of all the energy on the planet. Americans, who represent 4% of the planet's population, have produced 25% of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And all that stuff we put up there in the 1970s and 60s and 50s and 80s and 90s, it's all still there because carbon dioxide lasts more than a century in the air. That's what's heating the planet. And it's heating it in ways that are incredibly unjust. The iron law of climate change is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and the harder you get hit. So Africa, which is the number 1 casualty of climate change so far, I mean, right now we're seeing droughts so epic across the Horn of Africa that the pictures are like the ones that were coming back from Biafra in my youth, babies with swollen bellies and things. Africa, the entire continent, has produced 2% of all the carbon that's in the atmosphere, and yet they're taking it on the chin. So as with reparations for America's racial past, we owe a debt to the rest of the planet that we need to figure out how to repay. I guess the good news is we got wealthy as a nation, even if it wasn't divided equitably over these years. So we have some money to pay those debts if we want to, but we need to get to it. And in this case, sooner rather than later, because the climate is changing very, very fast. And if we don't fix it soon, then we will never fix it.
Will you describe a little bit about how you first came to conviction about writing about the climate
Yep.
and climate change as central to your life's work?
Sure. Um, so I was a journalist, in some ways still am. Um, and I was working, my first job out of college was working at the New Yorker magazine. And I did a long story for the New Yorker about where everything in my little apartment came from, traced all the pipes and wires back to their source, as it were. So I was down in, Brazil, looking at the oil wells where Con Ed was getting oil, and along the remarkable water system of New York City, and out on the garbage barges and so on. And I'll tell you what it did for me. It made me understand viscerally just how physical the world was. Look, a suburb is a way to kind of hide the physical operations of the planet from you. No one you don't know where your water comes from. It's all hidden, Once I understood that even Manhattan, a place that seems so powerful that it can mint money out of nothing, just out of sheer ideas, that it was exquisitely dependent on the safe operation of the physical planet. I think that set me up for reading the early science around climate change in the mid and late 1980s and understanding in a way that most journalists didn't just how vulnerable we were. So with that in mind, I wrote that first book, The End of Nature, when I was, I guess, 28. And, luckily, I guess it was a great success, came out in 24 languages eventually, and really set me on my life's work. But one of the problems was that it made it, in a sense, impossible for me to just go on being a kind of beat journalist, because I knew that I cared about the outcome. I wasn't purely objective. I didn't want the world to overheat and, wither away. And so I kept writing books and things, but I also began edging closer to the activism work that takes up, though it's all volunteer work, more of my time than writing does these days.
So, I'm here in Nashville, and there are still a lot of folks in the Southeast, and maybe, I don't know what the numbers are around the country, who still question the science, what they would say the purported science behind climate change. And I would imagine you've had lots of these kinds of conversations, but what would be some of your first replies to those who say, I'm still not so sure about all that stuff?
Well, you may not believe in climate change, but climate change believes in you. Look, this has gotten a lot easier, partly because we've built these big movements. The zeitgeist has really shifted. The polling data makes that clear. We're at about 70% of Americans who understand that we have a real problem and want the government to go to work on it. And 70% is a lot to get Americans to agree about anything these days. The other 30% are unlikely to shift. I don't think another study from, in the next issue of Geophysical Research Letters is going to shift them, because their opinion is ideological. And, if one had spent the last 30 years, marinating in Rush Limbaugh and Tucker Carlson and whatever, it gets hard to think straight about things. The bigger problem is taking that 70% and getting more of them kind of actively engaged in this fight. But sadly, that gets easier too each year, because at this point, it's not just book writers and movements and things that are educating people. It's Mother Nature who continues to, hit us upside the head with a 2x4 with increasing regularity. I mean, at a certain point, once you've seen enough forest fires and floods and things, who are you going to believe, Fox News or your own lying eyes? So we're also reaching a point, and this is the positive part of this, where people understand that we have real alternatives. Scientists and engineers have really done their job. The price of renewable energy, solar power, power from the wind, the batteries to store them, these things have dropped 90% in price over the last decade. This is the cheapest power on Earth now. And I'll tell you what's interesting. When we poll people about things, the thing that most unites Republicans, Democrats, and independents, when they poll people about a huge number of different issues and topics and ideas, the place where you find the greatest agreement at the highest numbers is on the question, would you like more solar power? Everybody in the earth, everybody in the country seems to want more solar power. The numbers are about 80% across the ideological spectrum. Now, I think sometimes for different reasons. Sometimes conservatives think, well, solar panels on my roof, then my house really is my castle and I don't have to depend on anyone else. And liberals are like, the warm power of the sun is uniting us all. Whatever. I mean, we can work with those kind of differences. And we should move very quickly in this direction. I remind often my Christian brothers and sisters that it'll be a good day when we move away from energy that comes from hell towards energy that comes from heaven. The good Lord was kind enough to hang a big ball of burning gas 93 million miles away in the sky, and now we have the wit to make full use of it. So that we should.
I think one question that I'm imagining a conservative question to you, a stereotypical conservative question, wondering how you would respond. That let's say for a moment that one agrees about a lot of the social justice questions, questions of inequity, injustice, disparity, and also hears your stories about that what the best of the flag means to you is standing up against tyrannical power, big power, unjust power. So a stereotypical conservative question might be to you something like, okay, if I agree with you that we need to make changes with regard to these issues that you've raised, but I also am suspicious of big power. What do you do with the possibility that big power solutions or big systemic solutions are yet one more step or one more possibility of tyrannical systems?
I think that's a good question. And truthfully, it's one of the reasons I like living in the little state of Vermont, Scale's important to me. And it's one of the reasons that I really love renewable energy. Quite aside from the fact that coal and gas and oil are destroying the planet at this point, it's also worth remembering the huge amount of unearned power that they give the small number of people who happen to live on top of those scattered deposits of hydrocarbons. So, the king of Saudi Arabia, this is a guy who cuts people's heads off with a sword when he doesn't like them. The only reason any person would ever pay attention to him is because his desert covers the biggest oil deposits in the world. At the moment, the best example of this phenomenon is Vladimir Putin. Look, Russia gets 60% of its export earnings from oil and gas. So, if you don't believe me, search your house for something of Russian manufacture that you might want to boycott in response to their invasion of Ukraine. Unless you have an old bottle of Stolichnaya in the back of the liquor cabinet someplace, I wager you won't find a thing from Russia because they're just a big gas station. That's all they are. And they use that power to try and intimidate Western Europe successfully for the last few decades. Now people are standing up, and they're doing it realizing that that one of the great things about power from the sun and the wind is that we all have some of them. Vladimir Putin can't block the sun. He can't turn off the wind. They're omnipresent. And so as we move in that direction, we move inexorably in the direction of a little more small d democratic power for, why would anyone want to send a check off every month for their life to Saudi Arabia or to Houston, for that matter, for their supply of oil when, the sun, when it rises above the horizon in the morning, can deliver it to you for free? It's a start on a world with very different kinds of power bases.
Mm. You, near the end of your book, you talk about how a drunken essay you wrote, I think for the Harvard College newspaper, the night that Reagan won against Carter, that you thought you would probably end up spending your life fighting battles that can't be won. How do you look back upon that phrase, that potential notion of your life's work these days?
Well, I think to some degree it's been true. I mean, we've been fighting an uphill battle ever since. Barack Obama asked to explain why he got so little done when he had 60 Democratic senators in his first term, said we were still operating in a kind of Reagan world. The constraints around turning to markets for every solution and things were still there. I'm very excited at the moment, though, by the number of people who are turning out to try and change that. And at the moment, the place where I'm working is with other people like me of a certain age. We've started this operation called Third Act, which organizes people over the age of 60 for action on climate and on democracy, trying to stand up to the voter suppression and so on. And it's been really, really fun because people are arriving in huge numbers to try and help out. People who may not have been political at all in their lives, but as we get nearer the exit than the entrance, we're beginning to realize that we don't want to leave behind a world that's shabbier than the one we inherited. And so it's been great fun to get to do that work, to get to do it in the company of young people. I was just recently outside at a demonstration outside Chase Bank, because Chase is the biggest lender to the fossil fuel industry that there is. And half the demonstration was high school students, sort of following in the Greta Thunberg mode, great moral witness. They were a little sprier than the rest of us, so they were at the front of the march. But behind them, there was a big crowd of older people marching under a banner that said "Fossils against fossil fuels." So it was in the right spirit. And when the young people, sometimes get in their okay boomer mode and are being a little snitty about the mess we may have left them, I do tell them, fight me if you will, but our generation did at least produce the greatest music of all time. And so it's really fun to have at Third Act people like Carole King and Bette Midler and, Neil Young and Patti Smith and others joining in. Those cultural icons from our first act are still around, and they can re-summon some of that spirit that helped us do things like the first Earth Day or the rise of taking women seriously or all those other things 50 years ago.
We've been talking to Bill McKibben, author of over a dozen books about the environment. Today, talking about his most recent book entitled The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon. A graying American looks back at his suburban boyhood and wonders what the hell happened. Thank you, Bill, for your time, and thanks so much for your work and sharing with us today.
Thank you, brother. A real pleasure.
Hello, my friends. Are you looking to find those true stories no one has ever told you about? Then you should check out the chart-topping podcast, Here's Where It Gets Interesting, hosted by longtime teacher Sharon McMahon, who you may know from her viral Instagram account, Sharon Says So. Here's where it gets interesting. We'll ignite your curiosity about the fascinating stuff that was not in history textbooks, like the sweeping history of Native Americans in the U.S., or the unknown stories that led to former Vice President Hubert Humphrey's pivotal impact in the civil rights movement. Not to mention, Sharon's joined by notable thought leaders, including former U.S. Representative Adam Kinzinger and no small endeavor friend and pastor Esau McCauley, who share insights about history, culture, and politics. So get the facts and listen to Here's Where It Gets Interesting with Sharon McMahon, wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriet Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.